for kids and parents using the creative delivery of evidence-based practices. Find us at childandteensolutions.com.
At Bishop Blanchette High School, you will be challenged to meet your highest potential. As a private Catholic co-ed college prep school with over 26 honors and AP courses, college level work begins before ever setting foot on a university campus. We offer over $2.6 million of financial aid annually, with 48% of our families receiving some level of assistance. Small class sizes, low student to teacher ratio, and integrated technology mean the learning experience is dynamic and engaging. We are the Braves, and there is a place for you here. Cause I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Cause I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy.
Hi, I want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining today's webinar, ParentMap's webinar, The Power of Showing Up, with Dr. Dan Siegel. I highly recommend this book. It's outstanding. I read it cover to cover. My name's Elaine Sulkin and I'm the publisher and CEO of ParentMap. For those of you not familiar with ParentMap, we are a content-rich resource devoted to assisting you on your parenting journey. We proudly publish free news magazines. We also publish a number of parenting books, and we host a website, ParentMap.com, and produce dozens of live and now our first virtual Zoom event. So thank you. Before we begin, we have a few housekeeping rules. First of all, this is going to be recorded and may be used for educational purposes or promotional usage. We wanted you to know that. We invite questions, so please use the Q&A at the box at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to those. We also couldn't do this without Zooming in to hear Dr. Siegel and without you. So thank you for supporting our virtual events. Now more than ever in these challenging times, it's our mission to provide Puget Sound families with the very best parenting content and events to help you navigate what is going on in our crazy world. So to support our mission, if you would like to support high quality journalism, we hope that you'll consider supporting our efforts on the Eventbrite page, registration page. We also couldn't do this without our presenting sponsor, Seattle Children's Hospital, and additional sponsors, Bishop Blanchette High School, Gideon School, Child and Teen Solutions, and the Seattle Jewish Community School. Thank you very much. Dan, it's good to see you again. I wish that good to see you. I wish when I was young and trying to be that good enough parent, someone sat me down and shared some of the remarkable wisdom that's in the power of showing up. It truly felt as I was reading this book that I was on an intimate and heartfelt journey, encouraged by you and your co-author, Tina Payne Bryson. Thank you. I highly recommend to our audience to consider going on this journey with Dan and Tina. It's charmingly illustrated and unravels many simple truths about what our kids really need to thrive. So with that, I turn it over to you, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks for having me. It's really an honor to be here with you. And, ParentMap is just a fabulous resource for everyone in the world, and you're lucky in the Seattle area to actually have you. So thank you for having me back. I'm sorry, I know we had initially planned on me being there in January, and the snow came, and you called me and said, please don't come because we're closing down because of the snow. And I thought we would have like a snowman building contest or something, but we had to shut down. And who would have thought that we wouldn't be able to get together now because of not snow, but a small little virus making big, big problems for humanity around the planet. So I'll try to weave some of the comments that I'll say today about the planetary pandemic we're now experiencing. However, these ideas are coming straight from the science of attachment. And Tina Payne Bryson, my wonderful co-author, and I, in each of the books that we write, we want to base everything we do in science. So if you're listening and you're interested in science, or you're an academic who's a researcher, for example, at the university, what I urge you to do is take advantage of some of the science-based textbooks. For example, The Developing Mind, 3rd edition, if you want to dive into the references of all the science behind what Tina and I wrote about in The Power of Showing Up, it's there for you. Today, what I'm going to do is just highlight a summary of the take-home messages from a review of all the science in this process we call interpersonal neurobiology, which basically takes the empirical studies, looks at them across disciplines, like, for example, taking the study of attachment in the larger field of child development, in the even larger field of psychology, and comparing it to, let's say, the field of neuroscience, which is a branch of biology, which can be seen to be connected to all the other fields of science, for example, like anthropology and the study of culture. So all of that we do in interpersonal neurobiology. And when I write those books for the Norton series of that name, or The Developing Mind is the original textbook in that field, what I try to do is ground everything in the science and show you how these sciences work together. In the parenting approach, which you can call simply a mind-sight approach to parenting, we see the mind-sight, and we try to offer to us as parents a way to build on this science. So in extracting the essence of attachment from attachment research, what we do is we study parent-child relationships and then look at how children from infancy onward are impacted by the way we communicate and connect with our children. That's what the word attachment from a scientific point of view means. So you may have heard of certain parenting approaches which use the word attachment, and I want to be really clear, as an attachment scientist, those processes have nothing to do with attachment science. So we're talking about a field called attachment, the research basis of that field, and then taking those scientific findings across many cultures and using them to cultivate an approach to parenting, which is based on the science of attachment. So when you reduce that down to the fundamental principles across cultures, it comes down to 4 S's, which are quite remarkable. The final of the 4 S's is called secure attachment. So in our field, what we do is we study children and their parents, and we can show that if children have had a secure relationship with their caregivers, and as human beings, we have more than one caregiver. We have something called alloparenting. So it isn't just about a child's relationship with a mother, it's actually to the mother, other caregivers like the father, grandparents, aunts, uncles. There's a selected few number of attachment figures. And we need to remember that, because unlike, let's say, a dog you might have, where the mother dog will not share the care for pups with another dog. Or I used to raise mice or rats, and those mice and those rats, they don't give their responsibility of raising those other mammalian babies to other members of their group. No, they don't at all. But we do as humans. So point number 1 is that for secure attachment, it isn't just about the relationship with, let's say, you're a mom listening to this, to you as a mom, or if you're a solo parent as a dad, to you as a dad. We have selected number of few, but more than one, attachment figures. One can be the primary attachment figure, but we can have more than one. And that's really important, because otherwise you may feel too much pressure, especially during the pandemic, You may, if you have this view that attachment is about holding a child to your body for the first 5 years of life, there is nothing in the science of humanity that says that that is the way to raise a child. It's just not scientific. When you look at how we raise children, they're raised in community. And that's an important first place. The second place to look at is secure attachment. While it brings a kind of increased chance of your child having all sorts of positive things I'll describe in a moment, it's not a guarantee of anything, because there's something called temperament, which arises from chance things that happen, or exposure to toxins, or even genetic issues that have essentially little to do with what we do behaviorally as parents. So we want to remember that attachment is important and we can influence it, but there are other factors that also shape how our children turn out. You can have, even identical twins can have different temperaments. And so they might have the same genetics, but their temperaments are different. So we want to honor that temperament is real and it's really important. It's just distinct from what we're about to talk about, which is attachment. The third major issue is to say that while security is the optimal way of promoting well-being for a child, there is a way to repair things. So if in the course of, hearing Elaine and me talk about these issues, or in reading the book, The Power of Showing Up, or any other book on attachment, like Parenting from the Inside Out, which I wrote with Mary Hartzell, what you'll find is this wonderful, wonderful, important lesson from science that says that we can make a repair when there's been disconnection. That if you hear what I'm about to say about the other 3 S's and go, oh my gosh, I haven't been doing it, or during the pandemic, it's been really hard to do those 3 S's, you don't have to despair. You can take a deep breath and you can make a repair. In fact, a colleague and friend and researcher, Ed Tronick, beautifully talks about how the ruptures in our connection, while we don't need to create them intentionally, they often happen. And it's the repair of the rupture. So a rupture would be something like you weren't giving what you needed to provide these other S's we're going to talk about. You recognize that, and then you make a shift in what you're doing, sometimes with an apology, sometimes with getting down at a child's level and making a reconnection. And what Ed beautifully says is those repairs of ruptures aren't something to be seen as a problem with you, but rather an opportunity to build resilience in your relationship. So that's the work of Ed Tronick. And you've probably seen, if you haven't, you should take a look at it, the still face experiment, just to give you a feeling on what Ed's talking about. The final thing I'll say is that we're going to identify different kinds of attachment. Ideally, we want to move towards security. If you find you yourself are in an area that's not secure for yourself internally, because we have adult attachment, but also for what your child has experienced with you, so that's the child's attachment to you, that's another opportunity to realize you can make a repair. And that can be a longer term process than just a disconnection that happened in the moment, but a deep increase in your understanding of yourself. And one of the questions that was submitted before we started was, why is a coherent narrative, a finding from the research in attachment, why does making sense of your life and making a coherent story play such an important role in attachment? And we'll talk about that as we go. So let me set you up now with the other S's. Elaine, let me just see if you have any questions before I go on. Is the technology working fine?
I think it's great.
Okay, beautiful. So let's go through these 3 S's that when they're there on a reliable basis and they don't happen, they get repaired on a pretty predictable way. Then you develop the 4th S we've already talked about, security. The first S is the fundamental nature of what children need. So remember, mammals for 200 million years have had a process of attachment where they really need to be, the babies need to be connected to the caregivers, the mothers for many of us as mammals, but for the various attachment figures for us as humans, to be safe. So the first S is safety. And safety has two parts to it. One, of course, is to protect our young from being hurt, because they're so immature when they're born. They need our bodies to help them literally be protected from dangers in the world, but they also need our connection to keep them warm, to keep them physiologically healthy. And these connections are not casual. They're literally, and I'm not saying this to be like overly, dramatic. They're literally a matter of life and death. So when you look at the networks of the brain for a child that are involved in attachment, one of them is the network that is connected to the body and the body's regulation and the body's capacity to send signals up to the head so that we become aware of what the body is. So that bodily network is one of three major networks. Life and death issues have a feeling deep in the brain, an area called the brainstem, that this is literally a survival issue right now. And so our attachment as children to our parents is basically an issue of, are we going to live or are we going to die? And I say it that way because sometimes we forget that in modern life and we're going around, in modern civilization. But the fact is, our mammalian babies, our baby humans, basically turn to us for their very survival. Now, the second aspect of safety is something that's usually not talked about, and that is if we ourselves are a source of terror for our children. Like, let's say I have a habit of drinking and I get drunk, and in my stupor, I may not even be attacking my child or even yelling at them, but I am terrifying because of my drunk state. That will induce a state of terror in the child, which is incompatible with secure attachment. I could be having a fight with my partner, my spouse, and in the screaming and yelling, even if I'm not yelling at my child, I'm yelling at my spouse. That can be terrifying to my child. Obviously, domestic abuse, domestic violence, or being abusive to a sibling. These can all be terrifying, and clearly emotional, physical, sexual, verbal abuse directly to a child can induce this state of terror. And what we've shown in our field of attachment science is that when a child is having terror inside of them that is created by a parent, that is a very unique situation, because a deep structure in the brain says, if I'm terrified, I need to get away from the source of terror. A slightly higher area of the brain, in the middle areas called the limbic areas, basically say, hey, I'm a mammal, so, if I'm terrified, I should go to my attachment figure to be protected. Well, if you as the attachment figure are either intentionally or unintentionally inducing a state of terror in your child, the child's brain has a paradox it cannot solve, because one part of that brain, the deep brainstem structure, says get away from you. The other part, the little bit higher limbic area, which is coordinating all this stuff, says, hey, I got to go to my attachment figure to be protected. But you are the attachment figure, and you are, as the attachment figure, scaring them, so they fragment. That's called disorganized attachment. And sadly, it has the worst outcome of any of the non-secure forms of attachment. The good news is totally treatable, totally repairable. But for many parents, the issue that got them to be terrifying their kids was not that they didn't love their kids. It's just that they hadn't made a coherent understanding of their own life, and they induced these states of terror. So this is not the second part of safety, is if we end up being the source of terror for our kids, we need to take a deep breath, note what we just did, and don't do what a lot of parents do, which says something like, oh, my kid will never remember this, or, oh, it's okay because they deserved it, or, maybe they'll just not think it's a big deal. No, it's actually a really big deal. I was just at UC Berkeley with about 24 of my colleagues about disorganized attachment. We were studying it and reviewing the recent unpublished findings about it. And for many reasons, it's just something as a clinician and as a dad and as an educator, I just want to let you know about. It's actually a big deal. So we need to keep that in mind, that the mechanisms in the brain are so fragmenting that fragmentation leads to something called dissociation, which is a disassociation of the usual continuity of certain features of the mind, that then under stress especially impair the capacity to cope with stress. And the ability to cope with stress, we're just going to call that resilience. So the first thing we're saying about the safety, the first S, is that when we've experienced compromises at the hand of our caregivers, we ourselves start having compromises to our resilience as children. So let's keep that in mind. When we're stressed beyond our ability to cope, with this pandemic, we need to realize that if we need to take a break and go to a separate room, if we need to cry out of control because we're so terrified ourselves, if we don't have support from another partner, we need to find a way that if we do unfortunately scare our children, that we come back together, take a deep breath, and I'll teach you some skills to do that so you can come back to be with your kids. Because there's something called, in the science of child development, we call it social referencing. Our children will use their social relationships with us to look at our face and see what we're feeling. So if you've been, taking in a lot of the news and you're terrified of the coronavirus and you're feeling so much fear about developing COVID-19 or a relative is going to get it or what's going to happen to the world, and uncertainty is driving you mad, take a deep breath, because that's an experience many of us are having. And as parents, it's an invitation to learn the kinds of techniques that, in this, I do a weekly community gathering called Pep Me Up gatherings for our personal experience during the planetary pandemic. Come join us. I'm teaching the deep techniques that you can use to actually cultivate this sense of well-being. And what's beautiful about it is there is a science of resilience. So whether you're a parent learning this or, partnering with UC San Francisco, we're doing this for first responders, with the Greater Good Society at UC Berkeley and the Mindsight Institute, we're actually teaching physicians and nurses the science of resilience. So as they go into the hospitals and into the clinics and are facing the kind of uncertainty that could actually take their own lives, and they're feeling such moral insult that the protective equipment isn't there for them, that uncertainty can get in the way of feeling the clarity of mind to do their medical work, number one. But many of those first responders in the medical world have children. So this question that we're talking about here is about, what do you do then when you come home, wash your clothes, if you are living at home, and come back with your kids, so that a part of your mind may feel, moral injustice with what has happened in the United States, of all things of this country, to be so unprepared, as a quote, advanced country, to be so unadvanced is beyond, as a physician, I'll just tell you, beyond medical comprehension. Of course, there's political issues here, but, so we'll just say, as a physician or nurse or someone working in the medical setting, you feel like, well, who's protecting me? In the attachment world, we actually have a term that Peter Fonagy in London coined. Well, he didn't coin it, but he adapted it from another field of science, which is called Epistemic Trust, which is how a child turns to a parent to see how we know about the nature of reality. So epistemology and philosophy is how we know what we know. Ontology is how we become what we become. Epistemic trust is a violation of the feeling that authority figures can be relied on for speaking the truth. So I'll just leave it at that. You can imagine the epistemic trust that's been violated in this country, and medical workers feel it. So if you're reading the news or you're working as a first responder, take a deep breath. And when you come back into the home, the way you interact with your child, because of social referencing, your child's going to look to your face. So you need to do your own inner work so that you can be a source of clarity and calm as best you can. And I don't mean pretend like there's not something going on, but you got to do something that, you know, I call name it to tame it. So you can name, I'm really upset about what's happening at the hospital. So give me 15 minutes just to calm down. And if you want to play some ping pong or, you know, let's do a video game. I'm not ready just to have a meal yet. I need to just get adjusted coming back. You can talk like that. That's different from coming in and looking absolutely terrified or screaming at the top of your lungs. Even though you may feel like doing that, we have a responsibility as parents not to frighten our kids. So that's the first S. Second S. Second S is seen, S-E-E-N. And, you know, a patient of mine, when I was first learning to be a therapist, I think had the best way of defining this, you know, when she got better, and I had no idea why she got better because I didn't do anything my supervisors told me to do. So I asked her to explain why she thought she got better. She was a graduate student, and, you know, she thought, oh, that's an interesting thing. I said, yeah, at UCLA, that's what we do. She goes, well, it's so obvious. And I said, well, I know it's obvious, but, you know, how would you put words to it? You know, she said, never before in my life, she said, did I feel felt by anyone. And that phrase from her, feeling felt, and I can just see her right now and feel the connection with her. That's what we're talking about joining as a we. And the word seen is just a way to remind ourselves that when we see the inner life of another person, they have the experience of feeling felt. We collectively can have the experience of feeling joined. And it's that joining that is the magic of attachment. It's where a separate individual has the feeling of belonging to a larger whole without losing their individuality. And we call that, in our field, integration. Things can be different and they can be joined. And in the joining, they don't lose their unique characteristics. That's what feeling felt is really all about. When we see our child, what it means is that we have an invitation as parents to see beneath the surface level of behavior so we know what to do in terms of what's my child really feeling? What's she going through? How can I help her? All these kinds of things. When that happens, the mind, the subjective experience of our child becomes honored. So this second S is really all about something called mind-sight. This is why we call it mind-sight parenting. In mind-sight parenting, what you're doing is you're saying, my ability to what Peter Fonagy would call mentalize or reflect on the inner nature of the mind. You know, we have a similar notion of mind-sight, seeing with your perceptual system, the mind. And it means literally, if I were to get into the brain thing and nerd out about the brain, we have networks just behind our forehead that make maps of all sorts of things, representations, and we can literally make a map of another person's subjective experience. It's what empathy is. We then actually use similar circuits to make a map of our own mind, and that's what insight is. And mindsight has insight, empathy, and also a third thing, which is integration, where you're having kindness and compassion be the way you live. So mindsight parenting says, my insight into my own inner world is so important, and that's where a coherent narrative comes in. My empathy to feel your feelings, but not become you, to think about what it's like to be you, cognitive empathy, to put myself in your perspective, to take joy in your joy and have empathic concern when you're suffering, which is a gateway to compassion, which is different from empathy. All these things are what we mean by the word empathy, those 5 things. And then you have compassion as a part of integration, where I'm going to link to you without becoming you. And if you're suffering, I'll help you. All of that is under the word seen. And again, we can have ruptures in the seen process. Making repair of that whenever we can is so vitally important. So that's the second S. Kids who are not seen, so just to review, the kids who aren't safe can develop disorganized attachment. The kids who aren't seen tend to develop what's called avoidant attachment, and that's about 20% of the population. Disorganized attachment can be, you know, anywhere from a quarter to a third of the population, unfortunately. In the avoidant attachment, unlike the fragmentation that you see with disorganized attachment, with avoidant attachment, what you see is a kind of disconnection. I become disconnected if I'm the child from my own inner life, from my own emotions, my own bodily sensations. And so when I go out in the world, I use physical sight, but I don't develop what I have a capacity to develop, but it's mind sight. Okay, so that's the avoidant attachment that comes when you're not seen. And then finally, the third S is soothed, SOOTHED. This means that if I'm a child and I'm distressed, you're my parent, you are going to sense my distress, make sense of it. Oh, Dan is feeling lonely. He wants to be with someone. And then do something to help me feel better. Giving me a hug, identifying my distressful state, having me feel seen and safe. All these things can lead to being soothed. And when I have the experience of being soothed, then, you know, I feel really, really good, because what I learn is I can be in a state of distress, and my parent, my mom, my dad, my other caregiver will have an interaction with me where I'll go from feeling really bad to feeling good. And those processes of being soothed then teach me a kind of resilience. I come to believe that I can rely on others for connection to feel better. And then I internalize that ability literally in the networks in the brain that are rewarding. So a second network in the attachment system is the dopamine-based reward network. And it's very much related to what's called the salience network, where things that are meaningful are registered in the brain. And the third network is the MindSight map making system, the MindSight network. And, you know, we know all how these three systems, the body system of sensing and regulating the body, the reward salient circuits, which determines what's meaningful, and the MindSight map making, where I make a map of your mind as my caregiver and my mind as a kid. And now I've got these three things that get interwoven: body, reward and meaning, and MindSight. So those three things are what we mean by the attachment system, which you may sense if you read the work on the, quote, social brain, that this is the social brain. In fact, the whole brain is really the social brain. We're very social creatures. So it's not like there's a separate brain that's social. And you can see that these attachment networks, these three networks, are about everything. It's about basically my whole body. It's about what's meaningful and rewarding. And it's about me having a sense of subjectively who I am and who you are. So attachment is not just some kind of extra. It is not icing on the cake. It's not even the cake. It's the main meal. And when we see attachment that way, we realize that when we keep our kids safe, when we can see them, when we can soothe them, they develop an integration of those three networks that basically give them what's called security. So as they go out in the world, they've internalized these positive experiences, and when they weren't happening, they're repaired. So remember, it's not about perfection, it's about parental presence, not parental perfection. Presence means we're open to being curious, accepting, and loving. So COAL, C-O-A-L, I'm curious of what's happening, I'm open to what's happening. When things don't go the way it is, I accept they didn't go the way it was, and I come with love to make a repair. That's the COAL state. And when we do that, that parental presence, our child develops secure attachment with us, and especially if we're the primary caregivers with the research studies, we will have the ability to regulate our emotions. We'll have the ability to stay clear thinking in the face of stress. We're going to use the capacity to say what we're feeling, express it to others, not in an entitled way, but in a way that says, here's what I'm feeling, and another person can see we're being vulnerable, we're being authentic, we're being honest, and they can connect with us in similar ways. So security of attachment in me sets me up for mutually rewarding relationships with others throughout my life. And that's what secure attachment gives.
Thank you, Dan. Amazing. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we have about 30 questions in 25 minutes. So first of all, I want to thank everyone for sending amazing questions. And I'm going to ask a couple and combine them, and then we'll try to move through some of these.
Great.
In the book, you talk about developing your own coherent narrative about your past. So why is that so important as an adult for your children? And then can you also, you talk about having a healthy emotional landscape. Can you define what you mean by that?
Yes, I can define. Yes, I can define both those. And in the Developing Mind third edition, which will be out in a couple weeks, you will find the deepest dive into the science of those two questions that you probably ever thought you'd ever want to get into. So if there's a scientist hearing these questions or asking these questions, please go to the developing mind, because what I'm going to summarize for you, if you're a scientist, you'll say, oh, that's a little too simplistic. Well, take a look at the science, because it's not simplistic. I mean, I had 18 interns work with me for a year to dive into these questions, these very questions. So I'll just say this. A coherent narrative is a phrase from attachment research coming from our work in linguistic analysis. And I don't need to go into the science, that's in the book, where literally we have a scientific way of assessing coherence versus incoherence. And it's beautiful. It's what I'm trained to do. I'm a narrative scientist. I study the way people tell stories. And so that term is not just Dan has an opinion about coherent narratives. No, it's like a deep science of thousands and thousands and thousands of people across cultures have been studied. And what we know is that when a parent can reflect using autobiographical reflections that begin, I'll give you my view of it. This is now not attachment research. It's my interpretation of what I think the brain science tells us. When the left hemisphere, which has a drive to make sense of things, can draw on the autobiographical memory deposited in the right hemisphere, the two of them can work beautifully together. And what emerges is a heartfelt, authentic reflection on layers of memory that we don't have time to get into here, but that combine something called implicit memory with explicit memory in basically making meaning of experience. So a narrative is different from just memory because it's how you extract meaning from memory. And in that coherent narrative, you've made meaning of even things that were terrifying and had no meaning when they were happening. So this is why the good news is that it isn't that you had a good childhood. You can learn and earn security by developing a coherent narrative. So that's the first thing. The second question about, what we call the emotional landscape of a parent, read the chapter on emotion in the developing mind, because what I'm going to say to you is going to sound weird, but you'll see the deep scientific reasoning backing up what I'm about to say, even though it may feel weird at first. The word emotion, there's no shared definition of what that is. So in the developing mind, what you'll see me propose is that what people really mean when they say the word emotion is a shift in integration. When integration is increased, you feel a harmony and vitality and flexibility. When integration is decreased, it goes towards chaos and rigidity. So it's kind of like a river where the central flow of the river is harmony. One bank of the river is chaos, one bank of the river is rigidity. If you then turn to every psychiatric disorder, you can reinterpret the entire diagnostic Bible of disorders as either chaos or rigidity as the symptoms. And no one talks about mental health in my field of psychiatry or the entire field of mental health. They really don't say exactly what it is because they don't say what the mind is. But anyway, that's what I've been working on for 30 years, to try to offer a definition of the mind and a definition of mental health. So for us, the phrase in this question, emotional landscape, is a synonym for the landscape of integration. And when integration is enhanced, when it's a part of a person's life, you develop a coherent narrative. You develop flexibility. You develop adaptability. You have coherence. You have this vitality and energy, and S, this spells the word faces, and it's flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. These are the qualities of an integrated system. And that's what we are, where there's these emerging systems of energy flow. And that's what a healthy emotional landscape is. It's an integrated one. So without the concept of integration, I would give you some kind of very superficial saying, well, emotional landscape is how you feel. And if you feel good, that's a good thing. No, you can feel sad and you can feel, let's say with the pandemic, you can be fully aware and present with the uncertainty of the pandemic. And you can then, and there's an incredible quote from a poet on the Brooklyn Public Library entryway, and it says this. It says, having abandoned the flimsy fantasy of certainty, I decided to wander. So as parents, if we abandon the flimsy fantasy of certainty, meaning a mental construction that life should be certain, and once you start saying should, you've put yourself into prison. Instead, if we learn to wander in a beautiful way through life and let the integrated flow of being present happen, then you can even be in a pandemic and you can be thriving. I know that sounds weird, and I know people are losing their lives, they're losing their livelihood, and it's a serious condition. I don't mean to minimize that at all. What I'm saying is it is what it is, and how do we stay present for it? And so we bring that presence to our children too.
So there are so many great questions. I'm going to try to put a few more together. So people are asking, I feel terrible about screaming, the additional pressure that's on parents right now in frustration. And how, I grew up with parents that screamed. How do I break this cycle? And without having a therapist, what are those resources that you can go to? And I think for all ages and stages of parenting, can you discuss successful repair attempts? Like, what does that look like? I'm talking to my teenage son who hasn't come out of the room and won't join dinner. And so
Great questions. So let's start with the resources. Caroline Welch, who's our CEO and also my life partner, the mother of our children, she wrote this beautiful book, which was written, of course, before the pandemic, but it couldn't be a more relevant resource for exactly these two questions. It's called The Gift of Presence, a Mindfulness Guide for Women. Now, she's also running these presence groups right now. So if you go to her website, carolinewelch.com, and you can hop on and be a part of those groups, literally, to find people you can talk to these issues about. The other resource, besides Caroline's book and her In the Presence of Women meetings, is the PEP meetings that you can get from my website that happen every Friday. And there you'll find an opportunity to talk to people about similar issues. We have a whole thing emerging about talking about parenting and addressing these exact questions. So, now we have over 10,000 people in the community, but the groups will be, small groups that can form that we're starting up. So come join us there. A second, or I guess third resource is to say this, that you actually can start right now in the pandemic to cultivate a coherent narrative based on the question you're asking, Elaine. Someone said, well, I grew up with this kind of yelling, I yell. If you do the resource Parenting from the Inside Out as a book, so I would start with that, get the power of showing up. There are videos you can do if you like video learning too, that literally will take you step by step in the Parenting from the Inside Out. It's like a manual. How do I actually go from being someone who screams and yells to someone who doesn't? That book is, a resource for exactly this question. And the next thing to say is and this is really related, I think Caroline's in The Gift of Presence, she interviewed 100 women, and she found that one of the things that emerged from them learning presence was something called purpose. So what we're doing in our PET meetings, planetary, personal experience, planetary pandemic, these meetings is how do we actually take the suffering and uncertainty, the terror that's coming up with the pandemic, and actually find meaning in all of this disruption? And how do we think about a world that maybe just in our imaginations that it could be, but then get ready to try to take the disruption of the world and the massive disorganization that's happening and create a kind of world that we really want our children to grow up in? That's one of the main reasons we have this PEP community, is to really think, what are the, in a sense, the personal explorations I can do, the PE, of planetary possibility, the new acronym there. And so come join us. And I think when you find that you do those two things, my personal development of a coherent narrative, I can learn something called 3-pillar mind training for free if you go to our website and start doing the Wheel of Awareness practice. We've had lots of parents email us and say, I was a yeller before, I've learned to do the Wheel of Awareness. Now I can go in my hub, and while I can see, essentially what the wheel does is It gives you a spaciousness of awareness and a metaphor of a hub of a wheel. It puts the urge to yell and the feeling of anger and I'm out of control as a point on the rim. And the more you develop this wheel of awareness practice, and I can give you example after example, but that's not the setting to do it here. And we're going to dive into that this week even more. What parents have written to us is this: I feel the urge to yell. 3 weeks ago, I would have been screaming at the top of my lungs. I somehow have learned to go to the hub. I see the yelling on the rim and I go, I'm choosing not to yell. And it worked. And they write these exclamation marks. It works, it works. And we want to go, yes, it works. We've done this with like over 50,000 people in person. We know it works. Yay, this is great. So what I'm going to ask you to do, and this is totally free, go to our website, start the Wheel of Awareness practice, come in whatever setting you want to do it, but develop, it's called 3-pillar practice. I don't get into the details of what that means, but you can actually develop your mind to transform yourself. And the good news is not only can you earn security, you can actually get your brain to be more integrated no matter your age. And all the different books I write, Mindsight, Brainstorm, whatever, they're all about how you can cultivate a more integrated brain, which means a more regulated, balanced life.
Great. There's a lot, I mean, first of all, I think so many parents are struggling right now, and I'm going to
Gotta go back.
keep reading. I'm going to keep reading some questions.
Am I back?
You're back.
Here we
I
go.
think you're back, and I think I'm back. I'm going to read a question quickly.
Did it cut off for you too?
It did.
Oh,
So,
wow. Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you for telling me. I thought it was my thing.
so Christine writes, if you are helping a child who has disorganized attachment as a result of one parent's terror-inducing behavior, how can the other parent help that child's fragmented beliefs repair? And I'm going to read another question. Does the number of times we have to make a repair have an effect on attachment? What if there's a continual cycle of rupture and repair?
Yeah, these are such great questions, Elaine. Thank you so much. And I'm glad we repaired our connection here. That's so nice. So you can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say a couple things. First of all, let's just take a deep breath and say that, you know, this conversation Elaine and I are having with all of you, all of us together, you know, is an invitation to realize that, you know, when we're parents, you know, nothing feels so important to us about caring for our kids. And then in the first question, you know, when a spouse or, you know, someone else helping raise the kids isn't aligned with us, you know, what do we do? And it can make us go wild with anxiety about it. So the good thing just to know is that you being a source of security for your kid, since alloparenting exists, will be really important. Assuming that your partner is not terrifying your kids, then, you know, they can have different forms of non-secure attachment with the other caregivers. And as long as they're not disorganized, meaning they're terrified of that person, you know, they'll figure it out anyway, but then you could take a deep breath and go, well, it's not optimal, but it's not so severe. On the other hand, and now this gets to, I think the second part of the question, you know, about rupture and repair. Ed Tronick, as I mentioned, talks about how repairing ruptures is a deep source of resilience. So we need to know that it's being human means there's going to be ruptures in our connection. And while that is true, so in everyday life, Ed's beautiful research shows, you know, there are times when we could have been connected and we're not. times we missed seeing our kids, times when we were distracted and didn't soothe them. Those soothing and seeing up, missed opportunities for connecting, you can make a repair of that. Okay, fine. When we're terrifying to our kids, I think we need to put that in a different category. So I think if Ed were here and having a discussion with him, I'd love to ask him, but his studies are really about seen and soothed forms of disconnection. In working with my colleagues in the attachment world, Ed's not a part of that. He does a different kind of work. What we study is disorganized attachment, among many things. But when we look at that, it's actually quite fragmenting for a child to have an attachment figure, not who doesn't see them or doesn't soothe them, but who's actually terrifying to them. So if you see your partner doing that, that needs to be stopped. If you yourself are doing it, that needs to be stopped. What do I mean by stop? The frequency of those things needs to be reduced. The intensity of them needs to be reduced. The length of time after a terrifying thing happens and the child is not having a repair needs to be reduced, shortened. That time needs to be shortened. You need to do some inner work, therapy or reading Parenting from the Inside Out or something, because it's kind of like saying, I keep on stabbing my child. Is that okay? No, it's not okay. Stab him once. Okay, get rid of your knife. The unresolved trauma and unresolved loss are at least two sources of why parents who love their children deeply are actually a source of terror. That's what the research shows. Unresolved trauma in you, unresolved loss in you. It's like a knife in your soul. Think about it. If you don't want to think about a knife, think about a splinter. If we were going jogging, right, in the days we go jogging together, and you had a splinter in your foot, Elaine and I say, let's go jogging, and I've got a splinter in my foot. She wouldn't really be a friend to say, hey, Dan, you're hobbling along, but that's okay. You'll throw out your back and everything. No, she'd say, let's stop. Let's take off your shoe. Let's look at your sole of your foot. Oh my gosh, you got a splinter. Let's take it out, let it heal. Now let's go jogging. And now I've got proper posture. Unresolved trauma and unresolved loss are like splinters in the soul of a parent. And you owe it to yourself at a minimum. And you owe it to your children, if you're going to bother bringing them into the world, to take the splinter out of your foot and then go walking through life with them, not hobbling around by stabbing them with your unresolved issues. So I'm just going to say that directly, because while I completely agree with Ed Tronick, and I wish he were here, because I would say, Ed, come on, that repair process you're talking about is not about kids being terrified, saying that repeatedly happens. No, that's traumatizing for a kid. And, when we were doing the research and seeing that the percentage of kids with disorganized attachment was much higher than we used to report it, it's because it isn't just when a child is abused. Of course, that can be terrifying. It's cases when it would not be a reportable situation that you are just doing something like freaking out yourself, screaming at the top of your lungs. No one would report you for abuse, but it's leading to disorganized attachment, which fragments your child's mind, makes their brain not integrated, and makes them not very resilient when it comes to dealing with things like the pandemic.
Great. I'm going to do another combo effort with the now 65 questions on the screen.
Oh my God.
I know. I would say to the audience, as a parent of 3 adult children and now a grandparent, and having literally just read this, the work does really start with us and the ability to pick up whatever book, but it is like you have to start. It's almost overwhelming because there is so much science, so many resources, and you don't know where to begin. Pick up one book. This one I would suggest, and you will start to delve into your own inner workings that will change things up. So here's a run-in on a few questions. How do you repair attachment with an adult child with an ambivalent attachment? What are the signs of disorganized or avoidant attachment? There's probably 20 questions in here about teenage boys and making, I think one thing that people are looking for from you, Dan, is give us an example of how you would talk to and try to do some repair work with a teenage boy who is quiet by nature, not very open about talking about emotions.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So, Elaine, you're talking about resources, so I will just mention Brainstorm. So I wrote a book called Brainstorm for adolescents themselves to read, and you as a parent of an adolescent can read it too, but it's really written from the perspective of me directly speaking as a dad, as a father, as a therapist, as a child psychiatrist, adolescent psychiatrist, directly to the kid. So adolescents can read that book. Now, that being said, there's two questions you're kind of combining. Like, one is like a kid who's 15, a boy who may be not able to express his emotions, and certainly that's very, very, very common. So not to pathologize that and turn that into a problem, but it's a challenge. And then the other thing you're talking about is very related, or could be related, which is, well, of these different kinds of attachment. One of them that I mentioned was avoidant attachment, which in the US is about 20% of the non-clinical population has an avoidant attachment to their primary caregiver. That's 1 out of 5. And they also have, like I think you're intuiting, they also have this, this lack of a development of their mind sight ability to sense their inner workings of their mind. So to put those all together, whether it's avoidant attachment or someone whose temperament makes them reluctant to talk about their inner life, or they're 15 and therefore they're like that, the gray pages of the Brainstorm book teach an adolescent how to, number one, become aware of their internal bodily state with an acronym called SIFT, S-I-F-T. So at a minimum, what you can say to your 15-year-old, if this is you asking the question, or the general issue for any of us, is let me take a moment right now, we can do it right now, and sift my mind. What does that mean? What are the sensations, S, in my body? What does my heart feel? What do my intestines feel? What do my muscles feel? Just like that, sensations. Fine, that's as raw data as we can get. My heart's pounding, I'm breathing fast, this kind of thing. Okay. I, images. What images do I have? Those could be sound images. I hear something. Visual images. I see someone running, or I see red, or whatever. F, feelings. What are the emotions I have, right? And thoughts. What am I thinking? Usually with sound of language, words. If you can at least start teaching, whether it's your avoidantly attached child, or if you're avoidantly attached, so you have what's called dismissing attachment, or your spouse does, or your partner, or a child with, shy temperament, or a 15-year-old, if they do the Brainstorm book, they learn to sift their minds. It's the first step of mind sight, is to have insight into what's going on. And if people don't, they have sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts, but they just may not be aware of these as experiences they can actually articulate. That's step number 1. Step number 2 is, and this is in the 3rd section of Brainstorm, is to realize that we all adapt the best we can to whatever experiences we've had. And in that section of the book, you'll see the most condensed, straightforward, practical summary of the field of attachment. Here's what may have happened to you. Here's how you would know. Here's what probably happened in your brain. Here's what you can do about it, all like in a few pages, And so if you wanted like the most condensed, consolidated, efficient summary of the entire field of the science of attachment, it's those pages, because I knew adolescents reading this book, they're going to have no patience for stuff that they get just, uninterested in. So I think the reason that book has been so available to adolescents is because it's very, here it is, this is why you can do it, boom, like that. And you can read it too as a parent. So in terms of avoidant attachment, what I would say in addition to the sifting is, when you look at the difference between the left and right hemisphere, the theory that I proposed years ago that's in the developing mind that looks like it's still likely to be true is that with avoidant attachment, the sensations of the body didn't get highlighted in the connection with the parent, which are in the right hemisphere. And instead there's a dominance in communication with language without nonverbal signals like eye contact, facial expression, tone of voice, posture, gestures, timing, intensity of response, those 7 nonverbal signals are picked up by the right hemisphere and sent by the right hemisphere. So if you're raised in a very intellectual home where words of the left are not coordinated with the nonverbal of the right, there's a kind of disintegration of the two. And that explains about 20% of the population, amazingly, including the lack of access to both insight into what's going on in your emotional life, including autobiographical memory, and a lack of awareness of the body. So when you put all that together in shorthand, these individuals, you'll see this in the Brainstorm book, need to cultivate their right hemisphere, which can be done. In the book Mindsight, you'll see a 90-year-old do it at that age. And he changed so much, his wife called me up and said, Dan, did you give Stuart a brain transplant? So neuroplasticity is how the brain changes in response to experience, and you can change your brain at any age.
So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. It's 3:30. First of all, that is such a positive and amazing note to end on, because I think so many parents feel like it's too far gone, my kid's too old, and there is always a way to repair. And so I want to leave everyone with a couple of messages. First of all, I hope people will join us on May 6th for Dan's friend and mine, Laura Kastner, who's going to join us.
Yay.
Who's going to join us on May 6th. And then I just want to leave 3, when I was reading the book, I kept wanting to make posters or little memes from things that just sat with me. So history is not destiny. Thank you.
Yes.
Neurons that fire together, wire together.
Yes.
Thank you. And let everything be a teacher in your life. And Dan, thank you very, very much for being a teacher in all of our lives. Truly.
My pleasure. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, everyone. And together, we're going to get through this pandemic, and there will be meaning we can make out of it. Let's do that together.
Thank you.
Thank you.